Welcome to a Fireside Reading of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 17, Part 2. Here is my humble dwelling, Master Copperfield. We entered a low, old-fashioned room, walked straight into from the street, and found there Mrs. Heap, who was the dead image of Uriah, only short. She received me with the utmost humility and apologized to me for giving her son a kiss, observing that, lowly as they were, they had their natural affections, which they hoped would give no offense to anyone. It was a perfectly decent room, half parlor and half kitchen, but not at all a snug room. The tea things were set upon the table, and the kettle was boiling on the hob. There was a chest of drawers with an escritoire on top for Uriah to read or write at of an evening. There was Uriah's blue bag lying down and vomiting papers. There was a company of Uriah's books commanded by Mr. Tidd. There was a corner cupboard, and there were the usual articles of furniture. I don't remember that any individual object had a bare, pinched, spare look, but I do remember that the whole place had. It was perhaps a part of Mrs. Heap's humility that she still wore weeds, notwithstanding the lapse of time that had occurred since Mr. Heap's decease. She still wore weeds. I think there was some compromise in the cap, but otherwise she was as weedy as in the early days of her mourning. "This is a day to be remembered, my Uriah, I am sure," said Mrs. Heap, taking the tea, "when Master Copperfield pays us a visit." "I said you'd think so, mother," said Uriah. "If I could have wished father to have remained among us for any reason," said Mrs. Heap, "it would have been that he might have known his company this afternoon." I felt embarrassed by these compliments, but I was sensible, too, of being entertained as an honoured guest, and I thought Mrs. Heap an agreeable woman. "My Uriah," said Mrs. Heap, "has looked forward to this, sir, a long while. He had his fears that our humbleness stood in the way, and I joined in them myself. Humble we are, humble we have been, humble we shall ever be," said Mrs. Heap. "I am sure you have no occasion to be so, ma'am," I said, "unless you like." "Thank you, sir," retorted Mrs. Heap. "We know our station and are thankful for it." I found that Mrs. Heap gradually got nearer to me, and that Uriah gradually got opposite to me, and that they respectfully plied me with the choicest of the eatables on the table. There was nothing particularly choice there, to be sure, but I took the will for the deed, and felt that they were very attentive. Presently they began to talk about aunts, and then I told them about mine, and about fathers and mothers, and then I told them about mine. And then Mrs. Heap began to talk about fathers-in-law, and then I began to tell her about mine, but stopped because my aunt had advised me to observe a silence on that subject. A tender young cork, however, would have had no more chance against a pair of corkscrews, or a tender young tooth against a pair of dentists, or a little shuttlecock against two battledores, than I had against Uriah and Mrs. Heap. They did just what they liked with me, and wormed things out of me that I had no desire to tell, with a certainty I blush to think of, the more especially as in my juvenile frankness I took some credit to myself for being so confidential, and felt that I was quite the patron of my two respectful entertainers. They were very fond of one another, that was certain. I take it that had its effect upon me as a touch of nature, but the skill with which the one followed up whatever the other said was a touch of art which I was still less proof against. When there was nothing more to be got out of me about myself, for on the Murdston and Grinby life and on my journey I was dumb, they began about Mr. Wickfield and Agnes. Uriah threw the ball to Mrs. Heap. Mrs. Heap caught it and threw it back to Uriah. Uriah kept it a little while, then sent it back to Mrs. Heap, and so they went on, tossing it about, until I had no idea who had got it and was quite bewildered. The ball itself was always changing, too. Now it was Mr. Wickfield, now Agnes, now the excellence of Mr. Wickfield, now my admiration of Agnes, now the extent of Mr. Wickfield's business and resources, now our domestic life after dinner, now the wine that Mr. Wickfield took, the reason why he took it, and the pity that it was he took so much. Now one thing, now another, then everything at once, and all the time without appearing to speak very often, or to do anything but sometimes encourage them a little for fear they should be overcome by their humility and the honour of my company. I found myself perpetually letting out something or other that I had no business to let out, and seeing the effect of it in the twinkling of Uriah's dinted nostrils. I had begun to be a little uncomfortable and to wish myself well out of the visit, when a figure coming down the street past the door, it stood open to air the room, which was warm, the weather being close for the time of year, came back again, looked in, and walked in, exclaiming loudly, "Copperfield! Is it possible?" It was Mr. Micawber. It was Mr. Micawber, with his eyeglass and his walking stick and his shirt collar and his genteel air and the condescending roll in his voice, all complete. "My dear Copperfield," said Mr. Micawber, putting out his hand, "this is indeed a meeting which is calculated to impress the mind with a sense of the instability and uncertainty of all human. In short, it is a most extraordinary thing. This meeting, walking along the street, reflecting upon the probability of something turning up, of which I am at present rather sanguine, I find a young but valued friend turn up, who is connected with the most eventful period of my life. I must say, with the turning point of my existence. Copperfield, my dear fellow, how do you do?" I really cannot say that I was glad to see Mr. Micawber there, but I was glad to see him too, and shook hands with him heartily, inquiring how Mrs. Micawber was. "Thank you," said Mr. Micawber, waving his hand as of old, and settling his chin in his shirt collar. "She is tolerably convalescent. The twins no longer derive their sustenance from nature's founts. In short," said Mr. Micawber, in one of his bursts of confidence, "they are weaned, and Mrs. Micawber is at present my travelling companion. She will be rejoiced, Copperfield, to renew her acquaintance with one who has proved himself in all respects a worthy minister at the sacred altar of friendship." I said I should be delighted to see her. "You are very good," said Mr. Micawber. Mr. Micawber then smiled, settled his chin again, and looked about him. "I have discovered my friend Copperfield," said Mr. Micawber genteelly, and without addressing himself particularly to anyone, "not in solitude, but partaking of a social meal in company with a widow lady and one who is apparently her offspring. In short, said Mr. Micawber, in another of his bursts of confidence, her son. I shall esteem it an honour to be presented. I could do no less under these circumstances than make Mr. Micawber known to Uriah Heep and his mother, which I accordingly did. As they abased themselves before him, Mr. Micawber took a seat and waved his hand in his most courtly manner. Any friend of my friend Copperfield's, said Mr. Micawber, has a personal claim upon myself. We are too humble, sir, said Mrs. Heep, my son and me, to be the friends of Master Copperfield. He has been so good as to take his tea with us, and we are thankful to him for his company. Also to you, sir, for the notice. Ma'am, returned Mr. Micawber with a bow, you are very obliging. And what are you doing, Copperfield? Still in the wine trade? I was excessively anxious to get Mr. Micawber away, and replied, with my hat in my hand and a very red face, I have no doubt, that I was a pupil at Dr. Strong's. A pupil, said Mr. Micawber, raising his eyebrows. I am extremely happy to hear it, although a friend like my friend Copperfield's, to Uriah and Mrs. Heep, does not require that cultivation which without his knowledge of men and things it would require, still it is a rich soil teeming with latent vegetation. In short, said Mr. Micawber, smiling in another burst of confidence, it is an intellect capable of getting up the classics to any extent. Uriah, with his long hands slowly twining over one another, made a ghastly writhe from the waist upwards to express his concurrence in this estimation of me. Shall we go and see Mrs. Micawber, sir? Said I, to get Mr. Micawber away. If you will do her that favour, Copperfield, replied Mr. Micawber, rising, I have no scruple in saying, in the presence of our friends here, that I am a man who has, for some years, contended against the pressure of pecuniary difficulties. I knew he was certain to say something of this kind. He always would be so boastful about his difficulties. Sometimes I have risen superior to my difficulties, sometimes my difficulties have, in short, have floored me. There have been times when I have administered a succession of faces to them. There have been times when they have been too many for me, and I have given in and said to Mrs. Micawber, in the words of Cato, Plato, thou reasonest well. It's all up now. I can show fight no more. But at no time in my life, said Mr. Micawber, have I enjoyed a higher degree of satisfaction than in pouring my griefs, if I may describe difficulties chiefly arising out of warrants of attorney and promissory notes at 2 and 4 months by that word, into the bosom of my friend Copperfield. Mr. Micawber closed this handsome tribute by saying, Mr. Heep, good evening. Mrs. Heep, your servant. And then walking out with me in his most fashionable manner, making a good deal of noise on the pavement with his shoes and humming a tune as he went. It was a little inn where Mr. Micawber put up, and he occupied a little room in it, partitioned off from the commercial room, and strongly flavoured with tobacco smoke. I think it was over the kitchen, because a warm, greasy smell appeared to come up through the chinks in the floor, and there was a flabby perspiration on the walls. I know it was near the bar, on account of the smell of spirits and jingling of glasses. Here, recumbent on a small sofa underneath a picture of a racehorse, with her head close to the fire and her feet pushing the mustard off the dumb waiter at the other end of the room, was Mrs. Micawber, to whom Mr. Micawber entered first, saying, "My dear, allow me to introduce to you a pupil of Dr. Strong's." I noticed, by the by, that although Mr. Micawber was just as much confused as ever about my age and standing, he always remembered as a genteel thing that I was a pupil of Dr. Strong's. Mrs. Micawber was amazed, but very glad to see me. I was very glad to see her too, and after an affectionate greeting on both sides, sat down on the small sofa near her. "My dear," said Mr. Micawber, "if you will mention to Copperfield what our present position is, which I have no doubt he will like to know, I will go and look at the paper the while and see whether anything turns up among the advertisements." "I thought you were at Plymouth, ma'am," said I to Mrs. Micawber as he went out. "My dear Master Copperfield," she replied, "we went to Plymouth." "To be on the spot?" I hinted. "Just so," said Mrs. Micawber, "to be on the spot. But the truth is, talent is not wanted in the custom house. The local influence of my family was quite unavailing to obtain any employment in that department for a man of Mr. Micawber's abilities. They would rather not have a man of Mr. Micawber's abilities. He would only show the deficiency of the others. Apart from which," said Mrs. Micawber, "I will not disguise from you, my dear Master Copperfield, that when that branch of my family which is settled in Plymouth became aware that Mr. Micawber was accompanied by myself, and by little Wilkins and his sister, and by the twins, they did not receive him with that ardour which he might have expected, being so newly released from captivity. In fact," said Mrs. Micawber, lowering her voice, "this is between ourselves, our reception was cool." "Dear me," I said. "Yes," said Mrs. Micawber, "it is truly painful to contemplate mankind in such an aspect, Master Copperfield, but our reception was decidedly cool. There is no doubt about it. In fact, that branch of my family which is settled in Plymouth became quite personal to Mr. Micawber before we had been there a week." I said and thought that they ought to be ashamed of themselves. "Still, so it was," continued Mrs. Micawber. "Under such circumstances, what could a man of Mr. Micawber's spirit do? But one obvious course was left: to borrow of that branch of my family the money to return to London, and to return at any sacrifice." "Then you all came back again, ma'am?" I said. "We all came back again," replied Mrs. Micawber. "Since then, I have consulted other branches of my family on the course which it is most expedient for Mr. Micawber to take, for I maintain that he must take some course, Master Copperfield," said Mrs. Micawber argumentatively. "It is clear that a family of 6, not including a domestic, cannot live upon air." "Certainly, ma'am," said I. "The opinion of those other branches of my family," pursued Mrs. Micawber, "is that Mr. Micawber should immediately turn his attention to coals." To what, ma'am?" "To coals," said Mrs. Micawber. "To the coal trade." Mr. Micawber was induced to think on inquiry that there might be an opening to a man of his talent in the Medway coal trade. Then, as Mr. Micawber very properly said, the first steps to be taken clearly was to come and see the Medway, which we came and saw. I say we, Master Copperfield, for I never will, said Mrs. Micawber with emotion, I never will desert Mr. Micawber. I murmured my admiration and approbation. We came, repeated Mrs. Micawber, and saw the Medway. My opinion of the coal trade on that river is that it may require talent, but that it certainly requires capital. Talent Mr. Micawber has. Capital Mr. Micawber has not. We saw, I think, the greater part of the Medway, and that is my individual conclusion. Being so near here, Mr. Micawber was of opinion that it would be rash not to come on and see the cathedral, firstly on account of its being so well worth seeing, and our never having seen it, and secondly on account of the great probability of something turning up in a cathedral town. We have been here, said Mrs. Micawber, 3 days. Nothing has, as yet, turned up, and it may not surprise you, my dear Master Copperfield, so much as it would a stranger, to know that we are at present waiting for a remittance from London to discharge our pecuniary obligations at this hotel. Until the arrival of that remittance, said Mrs. Micawber with much feeling, I am cut off from my home. I allude to lodgings in Pentonville, from my boy and girl, and from my twins. I felt the utmost sympathy for Mr. and Mrs. Micawber in this anxious extremity, and said as much to Mr. Micawber, who now returned, adding that I only wished I had money enough to lend them the amount they needed. Mr. Micawber's answer expressed the disturbance of his mind. He said, shaking hands with me, Copperfield, you are a true friend. But when the worst comes to the worst, no man is without a friend who is possessed of shaving materials. At this dreadful hint, Mrs. Micawber threw her arms around Mr. Micawber's neck and entreated him to be calm. He wept, but so far recovered almost immediately as to ring the bell for the waiter and bespeak a hot kidney pudding and a plate of shrimps for breakfast in the morning. When I took my leave of them, they both pressed me so much to come and dine before they went away that I could not refuse. But as I knew I could not come next day, when I should have a good deal to prepare in the evening, Mr. Micawber arranged that he would call at Dr. Strong's in the course of the morning, having a presentiment that the remittance would arrive by that post, and propose the day after, if it would suit me better. Accordingly, I was called out of school next forenoon and found Mr. Micawber in the parlour. He had called to say that the dinner would take place as proposed. When I asked him if the remittance had come, he pressed my hand and departed. As I was looking out of the window that same evening, it surprised me and made me rather uneasy to see Mr. Micawber and Uriah Heep walk past arm in arm. Uriah, humbly sensible of the honour that was done him, and Mr. Micawber taking a bland delight in extending his patronage to Uriah. But I was still more surprised when I went to the little hotel next day at the appointed dinner hour, which was 4 o'clock, to find, from what Mr. Micawber said, that he had gone home with Uriah and had drunk brandy and water at Mrs. Heaps. And I tell you what, my dear Copperfield, said Mr. Micawber, your friend Heap is a young fellow who might be Attorney General. If I had known that young man at the period when my difficulties came to a crisis, all I can say is that I believe my creditors would have been a great deal better managed than they were. I hardly understood how this could have been, seeing that Mr. Micawber had paid them nothing at all as it was, but I did not like to ask. Neither did I like to say that I hoped he had not been too communicative to Uriah, or to inquire if they had talked much about me. I was afraid of hurting Mr. Micawber's feelings, or, at all events, Mrs. Micawber's, she being very sensitive. But I was uncomfortable about it, too, and often thought about it afterwards. We had a beautiful little dinner, quite an elegant dish of fish, the kidney end of a loin of veal roasted, fried sausage meat, a partridge, and a pudding. There was wine, and there was strong ale, and after dinner Mrs. Micawber made us a bowl of hot punch with her own hands. Mr. Micawber was uncommonly convivial. I never saw him such good company. He made his face shine with that punch so that it looked as if he had been varnished all over. He got cheerfully sentimental about the town and proposed success to it, observing that Mrs. Micawber and himself had been made extremely snug and comfortable there, and that he never should forget the agreeable hours they had passed in Canterbury. He proposed me afterwards, and he and Mrs. Micawber and I took a review of our past acquaintance, in the course of which we sold the property all over again. Then I proposed Mrs. Micawber, or at least said modestly, "If you'll allow me, Mr. Micawber, I shall now have the pleasure of drinking your health, ma'am." On which Mr. Micawber delivered an eulogium on Mrs. Micawber's character, and said she had ever been his guide, philosopher, and friend, and that he would recommend me, when I came to a marrying time of life, to marry such another woman, if such another woman could be found. As the punch disappeared, Mr. Micawber became still more friendly and convivial. Mrs. Micawber's spirits becoming elevated too, we sang Auld Lang Syne. When we came to Here's a Hand, My Trusty Frere, we all joined hands round the table, and then we declared we would take a right good Willie Wart, and hadn't the least idea what it meant. We were really affected. In a word, I never saw anybody so thoroughly jovial as Mr. Micawber was, down to the very last moment of the evening, when I took a hearty farewell of himself and his amiable wife. Consequently, I was not prepared at 7 o'clock next morning to receive the following communication, dated 9:30 in the evening, a quarter of an hour after I had left him. "My dear young friend, the die is cast. All is over. Hiding the ravages of care with a sickly mask of mirth, I have not informed you this evening that there is no hope of the remittance. Under these circumstances, alike humiliating to endure, humiliating to contemplate, and humiliating to relate, I have discharged the pecuniary liability contracted at this establishment by giving a note of hand, made payable 14 days after date, at my residence, Pentonville, London. When it becomes due, it will not be taken up. The result is destruction. The bolt is impending, and the tree must fall. Let the wretched man who now addresses you, my dear Copperfield, be a beacon to you through life. He writes with that intention and in that hope. If he could think himself of so much use, one gleam of day might by possibility penetrate into the cheerless dungeon of his remaining existence, though his longevity is at present, to say the least of it, extremely problematical. This is the last communication, my dear Copperfield, you will ever receive from the beggared outcast, Wilkins Micawber. I was so shocked by the contents of this heart-rending letter that I ran off directly towards the little hotel, with the intention of taking it on my way to Dr. Strong's and trying to soothe Mr. Micawber with a word of comfort. But halfway there I met the London coach with Mr. and Mrs. Micawber up behind, Mr. Micawber the very picture of tranquil enjoyment, smiling at Mrs. Micawber's conversation, eating walnuts out of a paper bag with a bottle sticking out of his breast pocket. As they did not see me, I thought it best, all things considered, not to see them. So, with a great weight taken off my mind, I turned into a by-street that was the nearest way to the school, and felt, upon the whole, relieved that they were gone, though I still like them very much, nevertheless. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm going to see you all tomorrow, same time and place, 5 Pacific at Fireside Reading on Instagram. And all the chapters get uploaded along with a daily synopsis to the YouTube channel, Fireside Reading. And if you miss anything, you can always check it out there. And there are several people who like to watch the whole thing on YouTube, and I'm very happy for your company that way. Please subscribe and put in a comment when you listen and watch if you'd like. And until I see you all again, please stay very well. Good night.